The visual side of video production uses many of the same principles of visual language as photography and design. We can guide the viewer's eyes to specific parts of the frame by using compositional tools like leading lines, like we see here with the railroad tracks, frame within a frame, like we see with the trunks of the trees, and symmetry, like we see here with the rows of people at the desks. We can also create contrasts between the different visual elements in the frame, such as contrasts between bright and dark, where our eyes are drawn to the areas that show the highest amount of contrast in the scene, so the bright spots against the dark. We use different colors, contrasting colors, such as warm tones and cool tones, to create contrast in the image, or differences of shape, like the repeating patterns of squares in the background with the silhouettes of the people here, or differences in size and texture and detail. In the foreground here, we have two people who are actually creating a frame around the background here, where there's someone sitting much smaller, out of focus in the background. So there are a lot of different techniques that can all come together to help guide the viewer's eyes toward different parts of the frame. And they all interact with each other and can be used in different situations depending on what you have to work with. Two key differences exist between still photography or design and moving images like video or film. For one, with still visuals, the viewer has as much time as they want to analyze and get whatever information they want from the frame. This is a blessing and a curse because every little detail can and will be nitpicked. So any distractions that are in the frame will be noticed. But it also opens the door for very interesting and elaborate compositions that the viewer can spend more time deconstructing. With motion, the audience has only the duration of the clip to extract any information that the creator is trying to convey through the framing. So oftentimes it has to be very clear and concise how the viewer is supposed to interpret the image, because they might only have a few seconds or less to understand what's going on in the frame before you cut to the next one. Slight imperfections are less noticeable as long as viewers' eyes are drawn to what they are meant to be drawn to first. Secondly, video can use motion within the frame to draw viewers' eyes to where you want them to look. Viewers will naturally try to follow any movement on the screen, so clear movement and direction on screen becomes a key tool for communicating with motion. Whereas with stills, you are limited to, of course, a still image, and so you can't use the motion to draw anyone's eyes into the frame. You can imply motion through techniques in photography and stills, but it's not the same as showing a series of frames to truly create a moving image. These compositional techniques and ways that we use contrast to draw viewers' eyes to certain parts of the frame and to highlight our subject in the environment that they're in can serve a vital purpose in creating our videos. But there's a key component that interacts with all of this that can't be overlooked when creating images, and that is the lighting. The lighting also serves to draw the viewer's eyes to important parts of the frame, as well as to create depth and dimension. So one tool or framework or template that's been developed for creating pleasing lighting that draws viewers' eyes to the important part of the frame in both video and photography is three-point lighting. Traditionally, three-point lighting will refer to a standard studio lighting setup that consists of a key light, which is the brightest light, at 45 degrees to one side of the subject, the fill light, which is positioned 45 degrees to the other side of the subject in order to fill in the shadow created from the key light, with the camera between the two lights pointed toward the subject, then a backlight, which could also be called a rim light, a hair light, or a shoulder light, coming from behind the subject to one side or the other out of frame in order to create a slight highlight across the subject's backside that separates them from the background and emphasizes their silhouette or shape. Each light is at least slightly above eye level to achieve a natural lighting direction. This style of traditional three-point lighting and adherence to this formula for lighting has been such a staple of TV sit-down interviews that, unfortunately, the reasoning behind the three-point setup has often become overlooked, despite its incredible usefulness at understanding the topic of lighting as a whole. So the reasoning behind three-point lighting is that in order to light a person or object all the way around, there must be light coming from at least three directions around the person or object. That might sound like overkill, but anytime we capture a three-dimensional world, which is real life, and then compress it into a two-dimensional space, which would be the flat screen of a TV or the screen of a cinema, it is the lighting that preserves a sense of depth, form, and distance between objects in the scene. The direction of the light and differences in brightness on the various surfaces of a person or object, and the way the shadows interact with the space is what allows our brain to interpret the forms in the frame. It's the relationship between those 3 points of light that gives us the ability to make something look flat or three-dimensional. Three-point lighting is useful and has been widely adopted for a number of reasons. For one thing, and this might sound silly, but the camera needs enough light to capture a clear image. In video, this is particularly important because a deteriorated image with artifacts and grain dancing across the screen can be particularly distracting and make your video look amateurish. Another reason is because it highlights the main subject in the frame and draws viewers' eyes to them. The highlights and shadows created by the lights also create a sense of depth and three-dimensional shape to the subject, which is pleasing. You might be thinking, wait, do I need to drag 3 lights around with me and set them up every time I shoot video? No, that would be very impractical, and many people make fantastic looking video footage simply by using the light that is available to them because they know where to find it and how to position their subject relative to the available light to make it look good. Light coming in through a window could serve as a key light. A reflector or white poster board could serve as a fill light by reflecting light to fill in the shadows. A lamp could be placed somewhere in the background behind a subject and serve as a backlight or a rim light. Sometimes the key light might be large enough, such as on a cloudy day, to wrap around and fill in the necessary shadows. Or with smart framing, you could create separation between the subject and background with a shallow depth of field or brightness or color contrast of the subject and background, and in that case, a rim light might not be completely necessary to achieve that separation. If you look at a bunch of 60 Minutes interviews, you might think that three-point lighting is just a boring lighting setup. It's fine, it works, it looks professional, but it's not particularly creative or interesting. However, here's the secret to three-point light. Three-point lighting can be used as a framework for analyzing and understanding most lighting scenarios. If you can understand three-point lighting, you can begin to understand the immense topic of lighting as a whole. So when I use three-point lighting as a framework for understanding the lighting in images, I follow a step-by-step process. First, I identify the lighting on the key side of the subject. Where's the brightest light coming from in the image? And I find the highlight on the subject, and I identify that as the key. I then try to identify how dark the shadows on the fill side are. This is sometimes referred to as the contrast ratio between the highlight side or the key side and the shadow side, the fill side. So if there's a high contrast ratio, that means the highlight side is much brighter than the shadows on the fill side. If there's a low contrast ratio, there's not much difference between the highlight side and the shadow side. A low contrast ratio would sometimes be used in beauty lighting, where you're trying to illuminate the whole scene and make everything look bright and high key. A high contrast ratio would be more dramatic. From there, I try to identify if a rim light is being used to separate the subject from the background, or if a different technique is used. It's not always necessary to use a rim light, and a lot of times a rim light won't even be used. This is because through good framing or using set design, you can draw the viewer's eyes to the main subject of the scene and separate them from the background that way without needing to use the rim light. Rim lights can go a long way toward making an image look beautiful, but they aren't necessary all the time in order to make the image understandable. So let's use this three-point lighting as a framework and analyze some images. In this first image from Calvary, we have a simple one light setup. There's no rim light and there's not really a fill light. What there is a big window off to the side here, shining in light to the key side of the face. From there, we identify how much contrast there is on the shadow side in proportion to the highlight side. Without being on set, it can be difficult to understand what may or may not have been used to fill in the shadows on this side, but oftentimes it could be a reflector or it could be nothing at all. In this particular shot, it doesn't necessarily look like they used a reflector to fill in shadows or any type of lighting. It may have simply been a window that was creating the whole light for this scene. And then they relied on simple framing techniques to make the subject stand out from the background. If they wanted to fill in more of these shadows, they could place a reflector on this side over here. Or if they wanted to darken the shadows, they could use a negative fill, such as a black blanket, to absorb any light or block any light that is ambiently in the room from reaching her face. Now you might be thinking, hold on, she's illuminated all the way around, yet there's only one point of lighting in this particular shot. Well, it just so happens that light doesn't only travel in a straight line and then stop when it hits an object. It actually reflects off of every surface that it touches. So in this case, there's window light coming in from the side and then reflecting off of the back wall, maybe reflecting off of another wall on the other side of the room. It's just bouncing around all over. Of course, the brightest parts of the frame are going to be those in direct contact with the main light source, but there's also going to be an amount of ambient light that's just bouncing around and reflecting around the room. So that ambient light is probably what's filling in these shadows and causing them to not be super dark. It's a fairly light room in the sense that there's white walls. And if they really wanted to lift these shadows up even more, they could just put a reflector over on this side somewhere out of frame from the camera and then reflect light back in that way. But they might or might not be doing that in this case. Now in this image, it's interesting because we actually have the key light coming from behind that's also doubling as a rim light. So this key light is the sun shining down on the person's shoulders from behind. So it's a light that is above and behind the main subject. And then what's happening here is the light is bouncing up and reflecting off of this light-colored rocky surface and then reflecting the light back up and filling in the face on this side. This is very much veering off of traditional three-point lighting, but we are able to understand how the light is positioned all the way around this subject by analyzing where's the brightest part coming from, the sun over here, lighting, creating this rim light and separation from the background that way. And then there's light reflecting up off of this surface below and filling in the shadows on this side. And the way the actor is positioned in relation to this basically giant natural reflector helps determine where the shadows will fall on their face. They also could have, again, put a reflector somewhere over on this side and try to create a more directional light on the person's face. And then could have taken a black blanket over on this side and absorbed some of the light on this side of the face. And by doing so, you could create a highlight and a shadow portion of the face. These would be additional methods of modifying the light as it comes in. But in this case, they went with a flat or low contrast ratio on the actor's face and simply relied on the bright sunlight bouncing off of the light-colored ground and reflecting into the person's face. Now, in this still frame from the documentary Free Solo, we see an interview setup where the subject is being key lit from this side over here. So something out of frame is lighting them. I actually think based on the reflection in his eyes that they did add a light to create a little bit of direction to the light on the person's face. And they then decided how much contrast they wanted on the fill side here. So in this case, they may have used a reflector to fill in more light over on this side and bounced light in, or they maybe, again, wanted more drama and used a negative fill or a dark blanket to absorb as much light as possible from reflecting back in on that side. And again, we have a scenario where no rim light was used, but I think this is just super clever because we actually have contrasting colors and we have bright red pants that draw our attention onto the main subject of the frame. So in this case, it is a warm-toned wood cabinets in the background and a blue shirt, creating contrast between colors that draw our eyes onto the main subject. And of course, these bright red pants also draw our eyes onto the subject. There's also some frame within a frame going on here where we've got like a box around the main subject, and even a few leading lines that are kind of just drawing our eyes up into the frame. So all of these techniques go hand in hand and are used to help shape the image and to help guide the viewer's eyes toward what we want them to look at, while also showing the environment that's important for the story. So up until this point, we've shown images that may be using just one or two of the parts of the 3-point lighting setup. In this case, we actually see all three at work. We have a key light over on this side shining in onto the left side of the frame. And then again, we decide on how much contrast we want on the fill side. Could be using a reflector to reflect light in, or again, maybe using a negative fill, a blanket to create more contrast on that side, to absorb light or to prevent ambient light from reflecting back in and getting to the person's face. So that creates a deeper shadow using negative fill. And then we also see just a little bit of a rim light, just creating a little bit of separation there. In this case, I think what might be happening is the sun is probably somewhere up here, shining down. My drawing is terrible, but the sun might be up here, shining down, and then the light is being reflected in on the key side and just kind of wrapped around the face. So by using a white sheet or a white poster board or some type of reflector, they can take that light that might be positioned more to the side or behind the subject and then bounce it in to create a stronger highlight on the side of this person's face. Here we actually have something similar going on. So we have a bright background, which is kind of serving as our ambient light. They may have, and probably did, actually add additional lighting from this side to create this highlight on the person's face. Then they decide on the contrast ratio between the highlight side and the shadow side. So how much fill do they want on this side of the face? Again, you could use a reflector or negative fill to either brighten or darken this side of the face respectively. And then this strong backlight here, the bright ambience coming in, will also create that rim light that helps separate the subject from the background. In this example, again, we have something similar to a traditional 3-point light setup. We have something like window light coming in from the left side. That's creating the key light. Over here, we've decided how much fill we want. So how deep is the shadow on this side of the face? It's very much a side light. So it's creating more drama by having really only half of the face, like pretty much right through the center of the face is where we see the change from highlight to shadow. And then over on this side, there's a dark wall here, which could be the reason why it's so dark and shadowy on this side of the face. Or they may have actually added, again, some negative fill on this side to prevent light from reflecting back in. The higher the budget of the production, the harder it is to know for sure what they use, because there are lots of tools for solving these problems and creating the looks that the director may have wanted. In this case, we also have a little bit of a hair light going on here. We see just a little bit of shininess creating like a rim around Leo here. And that may or may not be coming from these little spotlights up here. In fact, it's most likely that they are not coming from those spotlights, and they rigged up some sort of lighting up above to create this little highlight on Leonardo DiCaprio's head. But this is a clear and obvious example of a 3-point lighting setup, just modified to fit the story a little bit. And here we have another example of a pretty obvious 3-point lighting setup. We have the key light on this side. Again, we decide how much shadow we want over on this side of the person's face. So is there a reflector to add more light? Is there negative fill to take away light? I would lean more toward negative fill, or maybe they didn't do anything in this case and they were just happy with how much light was being wrapped around onto the side of this person's face. The important thing when dealing with fill light is to just get the amount of fill that you actually want. And depending on the scenario, it may be easier to add a reflector or add some negative fill, or maybe set up an additional light to fill in the shadows. And then we also see kind of a hair light going on and a little bit of a rim light on the person on the shoulders here. This is a good example of what's called motivated lighting. So we have this bright fluorescent light from overhead that's visible in the shot. It looks like that it might be this shining down and creating the key light in this case, but that's far enough back that it's probably maybe just what's creating the hair light on this person back here. And it's definitely not creating this type of lighting on the person right here. So there was probably something out of frame that was actually creating the key light on the main subject of this frame, but it's motivated, the direction of the light, the side angle of the light is motivated by a light being back here somewhere. You can fool the audience a little bit into believing that light is coming from a little direction. It feels natural when you look at it, and if you don't look too close, that's a good way to motivate where the light is coming from on your main subject. Lighting and reflectors and fill and rim lights are all placed to the benefit of the story. It's certainly okay to make something that isn't completely accurate or true to life if it better communicates what the story is trying to tell. As soon as the image is captured in the camera, it's already being altered from reality anyway. So take the next step to have a say in how the light is shaped around the subject. Remember, we're taking a three-dimensional world and compressing it into a two-dimensional space, and we're losing so much of reality in that process that we can get some of it back by taking control over how the light is shaping the objects in the scene. So it's absolutely, totally fair play to use lighting to enhance the image. Now, playing off of that, we have this frame here, kind of a classic shot from Django Unchained, where a lot of not true to life things are happening, and this movie is heavily stylized all throughout. In this case, we have a very kind of unnatural rim light coming from the moon, and then this front side is all lit. It's actually an explosion taking place, so there's this warm fire-like key light coming in, mostly from the front, so it's actually kind of just all from the front. And then we have this strong backlight here, creating this very bright rim all the way around. And this is supposed to look like moonlight coming in from up over here, but of course the moon doesn't actually look like that. It's definitely a spotlight that's being used to create this rim light here. They use that technique all throughout the movie, and it's very much so not true to life, but it works for the story. And it fits with the style of the movie. There also seems to be a bit of shadow being created over on this side just to create a little bit of dimension to the face. In this case, when you have something completely front lit like that, you can create a little bit of dimension by placing negative fill over to one side, which again is just going to block some of the light from reaching that side of the person's face. And so we have a little bit of more shadow on this side and more highlight on this side. I don't know exactly how the key light was positioned in this, but the important thing is just noticing that there's a little bit more light on this side and a little bit less light on this side. So we have that dimensionality. We have a little bit of shape taking place. If it was completely uniform the whole way across and the same brightness level all the way across, we've really flattened out and lost depth in the image. And so by just adding a little bit of shadow to one side of the face, by removing some of the light or preventing some of the light from reaching that side, you can add a little bit of depth to the image. So again, it's good to understand traditional three-point lighting as a way to set up a standard interview lighting setup. And a lot of times, particularly people who work on documentary video production, will set up interviews with a three-point lighting setup or use that as the starting place for how they light their interviews. And then go from there based on the location, the tone of the interview, and what message they're trying to convey through the style of production. And then when we use three-point lighting as a framework for understanding lighting, We're really just trying to identify where the key light is, where's the brightest light coming from, how much or how little shadows are being used on the fill side, opposite of the key light, and then try to identify if there's a rim light being used, where the rim light might be being placed, or if there is a rim light even being used at all, or if there's a different technique being used instead to separate the subject from the background and make them clearly stand out from the environment that they're in, so that we have that separation and depth to the image. So that's how I think about three-point lighting. I hope that was beneficial for you to understand lighting as a whole and maybe think more in depth about some of the movies or TV shows you watch, and can begin to break down and analyze lighting on your own and maybe recreate some lighting setups that you've seen.